In 1938, New Zealand's unapologetically socialist Prime Minister, Michael Joseph Savage, implemented his own social security bill, which saw New Zealand promise an unemployment benefit for those over the age of 16, universal healthcare, and an old age pension at 60. It was New Zealand's answer to Roosevelt's New Deal, and if the New Deal was the American dream, then New Zealand had its own Kiwi dream with Savage's social security bill. The one big difference between the New Deal and Savage's bill was that Roosevelt's New Deal guaranteed a minimum wage. Savage's bill did not. Why? Because by 1938, for the past 40 years, New Zealand already had a minimum wage. New Zealand was the very first country in the world to guarantee its workers a livable income. Skip to 1967. New Zealand had stopped using the pound and established our own Kiwi dollar. The hourly wage for men was at 57 cents, which is $22 of today's dollars, while women made a mere 39 cents, 15 of today's dollars. Yes, New Zealand, a country celebrated for being the first country to institute the minimum wage and give women the right to vote, had a higher wage for men and a lower wage for women. However, what these numbers show is that by our own metric, New Zealanders today should be making $3 more than our current hourly wage of $18.90. On top of that, student debt didn't exist and costs across the board were lower. In 1967, the average price of a home was $7,700, which is $225,000 of today's dollars. To put that into context, as of 2020, the average house price in New Zealand is currently $665,000. During the 60s, people were spending money and businesses were making money. The minimum wage grew gradually at this time as strong unions made sure that wages matched both productivity and inflation. It was progressive wage growth which was responsible for this economic golden age. Businesses and the working class thrived during this time. Unfortunately, what government leaders and business owners once saw as economic pillars, vital to sustaining a robust economy, soon were seen as handouts. Which brings us to now. The first thing they won't tell you about the minimum wage is that there is no minimum wage. The minimum wage is dead. The original idea behind the minimum wage was that it would be enough for workers to make a living, enough to make the bare minimum. Currently, the average price of rent in New Zealand for a small one-bedroom home is $390. Now that's without utilities. Now, if a minimum wage worker today worked a 40-hour week, they would make $627 after tax, leaving $237 a week to cover utilities and expenses. This is not making the bare minimum. This is poverty. It's not a minimum wage, it's a starvation wage, and it's not just immoral, it's unsustainable. There are two different responses that people against the minimum wage would give when faced with this statistic. The first response is that people can live off $237 a week, just don't have kids and watch your spending, to which I'd say that you may as well stop listening or watching this video. There is no study, statistic, or historical precedent in the world which I can state to keep you from being an asshole. The second response, however, is that although it's reprehensible that we live in a system which has forced workers to live so lowly, the cost of raising the minimum wage would stifle small businesses and result in even more layoffs and higher unemployment. This is not an unreasonable concern, and this video is for you as I attempt to make the case for why capitalists and business owners should embrace a fluid minimum wage model. A wage model which regularly alters to adjust for factors such as inflation and production. On April 27, 2020, Dallas Mavericks owner and judge of TV Shark Tank, Mark Cuban, a man with a net worth of $4.3 billion, endorsed a federal increase in the US minimum wage. This was a massive victory for proponents of the wage increase, as a prominent billionaire brought a pragmatic argument to the discussion not often found when debating an increase in the minimum wage. That being the economic benefits of increased wages. Bernie Sanders for decades has pushed for an increase in the minimum wage. Sanders' problem, however, is that he doesn't want an increase in the wage because of the economic benefits, although he's aware that there are plenty. Sanders wants an increase because workers deserve to live above the poverty line. It's noble reasoning, but reasoning nonetheless which has compromised Sanders' position for many capitalists and small business owners. This crisis in credibility does not exist with Mark Cuban. Although his image isn't that of a ruthless, conniving billionaire, compassionate is not an adjective often used to describe the Cubes. Cuba's position on a minimum wage increase comes from a place of economic pragmatism. His priority is to make money, and there's nothing wrong with that. Too often do I hear people criticize capitalism as a philosophy which exploits workers and locks out competing businesses, and currently people who say this are absolutely right. But that isn't capitalism. Unchecked capitalism isn't true capitalism, it's cronyism. Being the owner of the Dallas Mavericks, Cuban knows that most people who attend these games are working class, and that the fewer people who can afford to attend games and buy merchandise means the less money he stands to make. So for Cuban, the situation is obvious. Increase wages so people can afford his product. Which brings me to a counter-argument often made against raising the minimum wage. That being, what if my production doesn't increase even though I'm now stuck paying my workers higher wages? My business may suffer. As stated before, this is a fair concern. However, consider the fact that in a study, CNBC found that in the US for workers making minimum wage, 32% of them left their jobs the year prior. This is double the turnover rate for employees making over $50,000 a year. According to a separate study published by Training Magazine, it costs businesses on average anywhere between $1,100 and $1,900 US to train just one new employee. This information shows that with a decent wage, the likelihood of leaving a minimum wage job halves. What businesses would pay in a wage increase for workers would not be spent retraining new employees. There is also an important added benefit. With a wage increase comes more potential customers who are more likely to afford your product, which brings me to the famous Card-and-Kruger study. In the early 90s, two economists, David Card and Alan Kruger, performed an experiment which would test the economies of two separate cities. They took two states, Pennsylvania and New Jersey, and two towns with just a border separating them. In New Jersey, the hourly wage was raised from $4.25 to $5.05, while in Pennsylvania, the next town over, the minimum wage stayed where it was. The purpose of the study was to find whether or not unemployment would rise as the result of an increase in the minimum wage. The way Card and Kruger would monitor the state's progress would be by referring to the restaurant and fast food businesses, as most minimum wage workers in the area worked in hospitality. Months later, in correspondence with restaurant and fast food managers in the state of New Jersey, they found that not only did unemployment not increase, but rather restaurants and fast food establishments had to hire more workers as they had more demand. Of course, this study had its flaws, mainly that it targeted only one industry. However, their findings were backed up with similar results in California, where 2 years prior, their minimum wage had increased along with employment once again rising. Although a minimum wage was implemented, it wasn't done out of a moral good. It wasn't done out of bleeding heart liberalism. It was done to create more business. If Reagan-era economics trickled down, this idea of consumer-based economics trickled back up, and it worked. More money for consumers means more demand for businesses, means more demand for workers. Although much appreciated, Card and Kruger's findings were hardly revolutionary. In fact, the experiment could be called redundant, as their findings reflected the 45-year experiment that was President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal. Someone who wanted to give his own 21st century spin on Roosevelt's New Deal was the first mainstream candidate to announce his presidency for the Democratic nomination, entrepreneur Andrew Yang. What he brought to the forefront of the Democratic primary was something called UBI, Universal Basic Income, that every American, no matter how rich or how poor, would be entitled to $1,000 in their bank accounts every month. This was an idea that Yang had as a way of combating the ever-present threat of automation on the American worker. Yang believed that if the government can cut a check for its citizens, it will keep the economy stimulated while enabling its citizens more freedom to create. Although Yang's idea is revolutionary, it may surprise the listener or viewer of this video to know that it's not a new idea. Before Andrew Yang floated the UBI program, it was already being debated decades prior between Republicans and Democrats. The debate wasn't over whether or not there should be a universal basic income, but rather how much it should be. In fact, it was Richard Nixon who put forward a UBI bill, with it being the Democrats shutting the legislation down. Why? Because the income wasn't high enough. That's right, it was famous bleeding heart liberal Richard Nixon who first proposed a universal basic income. Why would Nixon propose UBI? Because since the mid-30s he had seen the means of production raising as wages did so as well. There was an obvious correlation. This upward trend continued for the next 45 years, with the average hourly workday in the US dropping progressively. The origins of UBI stemmed from the fact that work hours were dropping while productivity continued to rise, and that it was time for the US government to bet on its citizens. UBI was the theory that if Americans had an income in place that they would be enabled to create more, which would continue to build up the American economy. A more present-day example of this would be in regards to how countries with right-wing governments are handling the coronavirus. The UK and Australian governments, both with conservative majorities, have compensated workers between 75 and 80% of their wages. The implication here is that nothing has changed since the 70s, and that even right-wing conservatives know the key to keeping an economy running. You may be thinking right now that I thought I was watching a video about the minimum wage, not UBI. The point of this video is to not illustrate the benefits of UBI, because if UBI were to be put into practice, there is no guarantee that it would work. Rather, the point is to illustrate the fact that politicians' willingness to go through with such a supposedly radical program implies that they know the key to building a robust economy. Jacinda Ardern and the Labour government over the past 2.5 years have raised the minimum wage from $15.75 to $18.90. It took John Key and the National Government 8 years to achieve the same increase for New Zealand workers. New Zealand is currently on the right track. The way we continue is a change in philosophy in how we view the minimum wage, and that's by viewing it as something fluid. As inflation rises and costs increase, so must citizens' wages. Right now, what we currently need from business owners and those not supportive of an hourly wage increase is simply perspective. It's understandable that the profits from not having to pay your workers a higher hourly wage are more concrete than the profits you have from not having to train new workers. New consumers who are now able to afford your product are also less concrete evidence, but please consider what history tells us. 45 years of economic growth in the most powerful country in the world, America, as well as our own. History supports that a fluid minimum wage is vital to a robust economy. Now, as of this video, the coronavirus pandemic has hit the US's economy to the point that unemployment has reached levels not seen since the Great Depression. However, unlike the Great Depression, America has the benefit of learning from its successes. Beginning in 1935, the US not only survived but thrived post-depression. They did so by investing in their unions, their healthcare, and education. And as an after effect, businesses became more prosperous. America did so through the economic enabling of its people, and that is what they won't tell you.